Two cops thought they had an easy target, a routine stop, a simple arrest. What they didn't know, he was the one who ran the entire department. The quiet evening air carried the faint sound of tires crunching against gravel as Julian Coleman, a 48-year-old man with a steady demeanor and a reputation for leadership, turned onto Sycamore Avenue. After a long but fulfilling day meeting with community leaders in Charlotte, North Carolina, he was finally headed home. His modest black sedan blended into the suburban streets, his mind drifting to the warmth of his wife's famous pot roast waiting at home. Thin red and blue lights, they flashed in his rearview mirror, cutting through the night like a warning siren. Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Momentarily, he checked his speedometer. 29 and a 35. No traffic violations. No. Broken taillights, yet the patrol car's siren wailed, signaling him to pull. Over. Stay calm, he muttered to himself as he signaled and eased his car to the side of the road. He knew the drill hands visible. Movement slow, polite demeanor. It was a routine he'd mastered not because he'd ever done anything wrong, but because he'd learned that in these situations, appearances could mean everything. The officer approached his window briskly, flashlight in hand, its beam slicing through the dimly lit interior of Julian's car. Another officer lingered near the rear, bumper hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You in a hurry tonight?" The first officer barked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "No, sir," Julian responded evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Just heading home." The officer's flashlight swept over Julian's face, lingering just a second, too long before darting down to his lap, his console, and then back to his face. "License and registration," he ordered, ignoring Julian's response. Julian reached slowly into his glove compartment, narrating every move. "I'm getting my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it after this." The officer didn't respond, but his posture stiffened. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, though the question felt rhetorical before Julian could respond. The officer continued, "You were driving erratically back there, swerving into the other lane." Julian frowned with respect. "Sir, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can verify that." The officer cut him off sharply. "Dash cam, huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Julian blinked, surprised by the sudden escalation. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Now, Julian's stomach churned, but he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly, his hands raised in clear view. The second officer moved in quickly, grabbing Julian's arm and yanking him toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" Julian asked, his voice measured but firm. "I've done nothing wrong. Resisting, huh?" The first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine. By me." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Julian's wrists. His mind raced. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was profiling, plain and simple. As the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car, Julian glanced down the street. A few neighbors peeked through their blinds, their silhouettes illuminated by the glow of their porch lights. No one stepped outside. But this was far from over. The officers had no idea who they had just arrested, and Julie wasn't planning to stay silent for long. The patrol car rattled slightly as it rolled down the street. Julian sitting stiffly in the back seat, he glanced out the window, watching familiar landmarks blur past, but his mind wasn't on the scenery. Instead, he was trying to process the absurdity of what just happened. The two officers sat up front, exchanging casual banter as though they hadn't just handcuffed and detained a man without cause. The younger one, Officer Daniels, glanced back at Julian through the rearview mirror. "So what's your story? Late night drug run, or you just like giving us a hard time?" Julian met Daniel's gaze, unflinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." "Yeah, sure." The other officer, a stocky man named Officer Reed, snorted. "We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Julian bit his tongue, arguing now wouldn't help. He took a deep breath, mentally running through his options. He knew his rights. He also knew the system. And the odds that it would favor him in this moment were slim when they arrived at the precinct. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the holding area, Daniels. Remove Julian's cuffs with an almost mocking flourish. Welcome to our humble abode. You're going to be here for a... While am I being charged? Jewel asked, calmly rubbing his wrists. Reed smirked. Week let you know. Once we figure that out, sit. Tight Julian was led into a small, cold holding cell. The door clanged shut. Behind him, the echo lingering in the air. He sat on the bench, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts he'd spent years building a career rooted in justice and fairness, and now he was being subjected to the very abuse of power he'd worked to eradicate. Outside the cell, the two officers leaned against a desk, laughing quietly as they reviewed Julian's license and car. Registration, nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel said, sounding almost disappointed. Doesn't matter, Reed replied, with a smirk. We'll find something, guys. Like him always have skeletons in the closet. Julian overheard their exchange. His expression unreadable. He remained seated, hands clasped, posture steady. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. He knew his patience would pay off soon. Enough hours dragged by other officers came and went, casting curious glances at the man in the cell. None of them seemed to recognize him, but Julian didn't expect them to. He was new to the area, having taken the position only 3 weeks prior. Finally, just as dawn began to streak the sky with faint orange hues, Julian heard footsteps approaching as a stern-looking officer, clearly higher ranking, appeared in front of the cell. Her badge read Lieutenant Morgan. She carried an air of authority and professionalism that immediately contrasted with the other two officers. She frowned as she glanced at Julian, then back at the paperwork in her hand. What's going on here? Daniel stepped forward. Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest. Morgan arched an eyebrow. Reckless driving? Where's the evidence? We haven't processed it yet, Reed said casually, leaning against the desk. Morgan turned her attention back to Julian. Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped? Julian stood, meeting her gaze. Calmly, I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events. Morgan's expression hardened as she glanced at the two officers. You didn't review his dash cam? Reed shrugged. We didn't get to it yet. Morgan exhaled sharply, clearly displeased. Get it now. And Daniels read, my office. Now, as the two officers slunk away, Julian knew the tide was beginning to turn, but this was just the beginning of their reckoning. The cold metal bench pressed against Julian's back as he sat in the cell watching the precinct buzz with activity. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of papers or distant conversations. Despite the stillness around him, Julian's mind was anything but calm. He thought about the night's events, replaying them like a movie. Every sharp word, every unnecessary escalation, it all served as a stark reminder of the deep flaws he'd spent years fighting to fix. His new position as police chief had been an opportunity to address these issues from within, to create a culture of accountability. And now here he was experiencing the very injustice he had vowed to dismantle. The sound of footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. Lieutenant Morgan returned, holding a tablet. She gestured for him to step closer to the bars. We reviewed your dash cam footage, she said, her tone clipped but professional. I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear, this should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely. Julian raised an eyebrow, not surprised, but still waiting for her to continue. I'll be releasing you immediately, she added, but I'd like to discuss next steps privately. Moments later, Julian was out of the cell and seated across from Morgan in her office. The room was stark, with a dead desk, a couple of chairs, and a small file cabinet. No frills, no. Distractions, just business. I'll be filing a report against Daniels, and Reed Morgan began folding her hands on the desk. But there's something I need to ask. She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. Who are you? Really? You're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell over nothing. Julian leaned back slightly, giving her a small, measured smile. I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant, but let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm. Morgan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation. As Julian left the precinct, the early morning sun warmed his face, but the weight of the night lingered heavily on his shoulders. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove to his office, parked in his reserved space, and walked through the doors of the police headquarters. He now oversaw his assistant Anita looked up from her desk, startled. Chief Coleman, you're here early. Julian gave her a nod, his expression neutral. It's been a long night, Anita. Could you prepare a briefing room for me? I need to address the department this afternoon. Anita nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his tone as Julian stepped into his office and closed the door behind him. He exhaled deeply. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just about him. It was about what his experience represented. The public trusted him to lead, to protect, and to hold others accountable. That responsibility weighed heavily, but Julian welcomed it. But before he could act, though, there was one more storm to weather: the courtroom, where everything would come to light. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the case, and local media outlets were eager to cover it. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop reporters from lining the courthouse steps, ready to pounce as soon as the hearing adjourned. Julian sat quietly at the defendant's table, his lawyer Sandra Reyes flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Sandra was a fork to be reckoned with, sharp, unrelenting, and with a reputation for dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. Across the room, officers Daniels and Reed sat with their department-appointed attorney. Daniels looked nervous, his foot tapping uncontrollably, while Reed tried to appear unfazed, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the room and called the session to order. We here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Julian Coleman. Prosecution, you may proceed. The prosecutor, a young and somewhat hesitant lawyer, stood and began outlining the case as it was initially reported on the night in question. The defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by officers Daniels and Reed, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest. Sandra barely suppressed a smile. She leaned over to Julian and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn, Sandra stood confidently, her voice commanding the room. Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but are also a direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer statements. The judge nodded. Proceed. Sandra gestured to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights and began playing the dash cam footage. The room fell silent as the video showed Julian driving steadily within his lane, the speedometer reading a constant 29 mph. The officer's patrol car visible in the rearview mirror turned on its lights without cause. Next came the body cam footage. The courtroom watched as the officers approached Julian's car, their aggressive tone evident from the first action. The footage revealed Daniels muttering under his breath, another one of them causing trouble, followed by Reed chuckling and replying. Figures, gasps rippled through the audience. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as he glanced at the officers. Sandra paused the video and addressed the court. This is the professionalism displayed by officers Daniels and Reed. Now let's fast forward to the arrest itself. The footage continued showing Julian complying, calmly narrating his movements as he retrieved his registration and licensed. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the officer's hostility was stark. By the time the video finished, the courtroom was tense. Sandra turned to the jury and said, "This is not just an abuse of power. This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." The pros stood visibly. Flustered, the officers believed they had probable cause. Sandra cut in sharply. Probable cause based on what? Driving safely, following instructions, or perhaps it was the color of his skin. The judge banged his gavel lightly, calling for order. "Litun, keep this focused." Sandra's voice softened, but her words were no less powerful. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, my client has something to share with the court." Julian stood adjusting his tie. He scanned the room, making eye contact with the officers before addressing the judge. "My name is Julian Coleman," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I am the chief of police for this city. I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here. Today, I chose not to disclose my position early because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference." And now, as the room erupted in murmurs, Daniel's face turned pale while Reed's smugness evaporated in an instant. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding silence. Julian continued, "This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Daniels and Reed to operate without accountability that ends now." But this moment wasn't just a revelation, it was a reckoning one that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom walls. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Julian took his seat, his final words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Daniels and Reed sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. The judge called for a brief recess, giving everyone time to absorb what had just transpired. By the time resumed, the tone had shifted completely. The prosecution offered no further arguments, and the judge dismissed the charges against Julian immediately. But that was only the beginning. As Julian stepped outside, the courthouse reporter swarmed him, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. "Chief Coleman, do you have a statement about the case?" one called out. Julian raised his hand, signaling for silence. The crowd stilled, eager for his response. "This case isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve as a police chief. I'm committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness, and as a citizen, I'll continue to fight for justice." The media frenzy continued, but Julian didn't linger. He had more important matter to address. The fallout from the case was swift. Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Public outrage grew as the footage was released to the press, sparking protests and calls for reform. Community leaders rallied together, demanding greater transparency and better training for officers within the department. Julian's leadership took on a new significance. He called an emergency meeting gathering. Officer in the precinct standing at the front of the room, he addressed them with unwavering conviction. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident," Julian said, scanning the room. "It was a symptom of a larger problem. And as long as I'm chief, I won't tolerate it. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. If you can't uphold those values, this isn't the place for you." The room was silent, his words cutting through any lingering doubt about his intentions. Over the following weeks, Julian led the charge in transforming the department. Mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and an anonymous reporting system for officer misconduct were just the first steps. He knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, but he was determined to prove that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Months later, at a town hall meeting, Julian sat on a panel, listening as a young man stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "Chief Coleman," he said, "what you went through, it could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Julian nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of responsibility but full of resolve. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, scanning the faces of those who had come seeking hope. "But change does happen when we refuse to be silent, when we refuse to accept injustice as the status quo. Together, we can build a system that truly serves everyone." As the town hall ended, Julian lingered for a moment, watching people leave with a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't over. It never would be. But the movement had begun, and he wasn't alone in it anymore. Because real change isn't the work of one man, it's the responsibility of us all. If we witness injustice, we must call it out. If we want reform, we must demand it. Together, we don't just hope for a better world, we build it. Accountability isn't just a promise. It must be a reality. And the time to make it happen is now.